earned her PhD from the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, United Kingdom. She has also an MSc in Communications from the University of Nairobi and BSc in Information Science from Moi University. Thank you.
All right. On that note, we now invite Dr. Rose Oronje. You have the floor. And I've made you a co-host so you can...
Okay, so as I said, we are covering strategic communications, which is communication, how to use communication as an important tool in ensuring that you influence policymakers. And so at this point, we are assuming that we have done good research, we have robust research, and now we are at the point where we need to focus on how do we communicate this? How do we make the right connections with partners, with different actors to ensure that this research can play a role in discussions around policy, be it by politicians, be it by technocrats in government agencies, or even people implementing projects or providing services at the lower level. And so through this session, I'm going to take us through some key elements of strategic communications, as well as, of course, at the end of the session, I'll get us to also put some of the things I talk about to practice, because learning is more about practice than reading or hearing what experts say in these areas. So just to move on, I'll highlight some of the key elements of strategic communications. The first one is having a clear goal of why you are communicating. I will get into a bit more detail on that. The second one is being clear on the audiences you need to engage in order for you to realize your goal. The third one is having clear communications objectives. You know, what do you want your communications to achieve? The fourth one is messages. The fifth one is formats. The sixth one is pre-testing your messages and implementing them, and of course, evaluating. So you will see that this is kind of a staircase that we have here, meaning that setting the ground with the first step, and the second one and the third one are really core as are their building grounds for the next stages of the communications process. So getting on to speak a bit more on the setting your goal when you think about strategic communications. And here we are talking about a policy goal, you know, because our training is focused on being more effective in ensuring that you're supporting policymakers to make decisions drawing on good and robust evidence. And so you're thinking about what is your policy goal? What is it that you ultimately want to change? And at policy level, we are thinking about, you want to bring about increase in budgeting for a particular issue. You might want to bring about a new policy. Maybe there's no policy on an area that has been neglected, or there's a policy that you want to have changed or updated, or, you know, updated because there are other emerging things. And so you're thinking more of the overarching or the ultimate goal that you want to achieve, and you want to clearly define that so that you don't get into doing other things without, you know, being clear on what your goal is. And so you're also going back to thinking about the problem. You know, what problem is there that you're seeking to address with your research or with your evidence, or with the evidence that is available from other sources that you may not be the one who conducted it anyway, but you are synthesizing that evidence to inform a specific issue. And so the goal needs to revolve around the development problem that you're trying to address. And so coming up with an overarching goal that you want to realize, that you would tell you that you have realized success. And so we have an example here of a policy goal of a group of NGOs who are doing some work on adolescent reproductive health. And their goal here, which I'll just read out aloud, is Kenya passes new adolescent reproductive health policy, reproductive health and development policy that is more responsive to sexual and reproductive health needs of youth. So of course, these people want to have a new policy that speaks more to adolescent SRH issues. In this case, of course, there was a policy in place that was not specifically addressing all SRH issues as far as adolescents are concerned. And so they want to instigate a new policy that is now more responsive and holistic. One thing to clarify when you're thinking about your policy goal is also to ensure that you're not confusing that with program goals. And so a policy goal will be focused on changes in policy and changes in resource allocations, whereas program goals will be more focused on changing behaviors, you know, and service level indicators. And so policy goal, I think the main difference we want to make is that policy goal is more in the upstream. Yes, if you achieve your goal, it may actually influence things, you know, downstream if it gets implemented. However, it's important that you are clear and you're not putting up a program goal as your policy goal that you want to achieve. And so here we also have examples. Example of a policy goal is given here is to double the budget line for family planning within the next 5 years. And then on the other side, if you're working on programs, then the example of the goal given here is to decrease the number of births to adolescents by 20% by the year 2017. And so you see that the program goal is more about service provision, you know. And so this may be goals for people who are coming up with specific programs and to provide services to young people. That would be an example of a goal they would come about. Whereas for us who are working at the policy level, we are looking more at higher level goals than lower level program or service provision goals. Having made that clarification, just to move on the second step, which is identifying your goal, your audiences. So once you are clear, you know, on the overarching goal that you want to realize, the next step is really to think about who are the audiences, who are the actors who are going to ensure that I achieve my goal, or who are the actors who will bring about the action, you know, that is required in my goal. And so here you need to be more specific in thinking about who those actors are. And we are going to talk a bit more in terms of understanding them. So it's not just knowing it's the, you know, the Minister for Education, for instance, but it's really knowing a lot more about that person so that you become more strategic in the way you communicate your messages or you communicate your research to them. And so you want to think about segmenting your audiences. Mostly we talk about this in two broad groups. So you want to think about who are the primary actors, and these are the ones who will directly give you what you want, you know, who will act on your policy issue. And then we'll have a group of actors who are secondary. So these are people who are not the ones who will give you the change you need, but they can influence, you know, the ones who can give you the change you need, or they can also even influence them negatively, you know, for you not to get the change you need. So important for you as well to be clear on who your secondary audiences are, because you need to know your allies whom you can work with in bringing about the policy goal, but you also need to know the people who will stand in your way, you know, the opponents, and be clear on how am I going to engage or how am I going to counter the messages they put across, you know, which kind of stops you from achieving your goal. On this slide, we're just highlighting some of the possible audiences. An important point to bear in mind here is that your audiences will again depend on what your policy goal is. And so what we're giving here are examples. But depending on what your policy goal is, that is what will determine who your audiences are. You know, who are the people who will either give you the action that you need or who will support your efforts in getting the action that you need. And so some of the audiences may include political leaders, be it at state level or at federal government level, government officials, they may be program managers, private sector, educators, or even people in business, as well as, of course, actors out of the state, you know, so news media, donors, religious leaders, and other groups. It's important to, as you get to analyze your audience, it's important for you to map them and understand their power and their interests as far as your policy goal or your issue or the problem area is concerned. And so we like to use this power interest matrix, which of course on your left you have the power axis, which either actors have higher power, and power really is about influence. You know, what influence do they have on the issue? So either people have a lot of influence on the issue, which means they would be at the top of the axis, or they have low influence, or they have mid-level influence on the issue. At the bottom here, we have the interest axis. And again, people may have low interest, or they may have a lot of interest. And interest here, we are thinking more of whether people are concerned about this specific issue you're trying to address, or they are affected by that issue, you know. And I like to give an example of, say, the education sector, an education issue, where youth may not necessarily be interested in education, you know, but they will be affected. So in which case you are still grouping them here as people who will be affected by the issue. And so their interests are at stake as far as education is concerned. And so they would be at the higher side of this matrix. The value of using the power interest matrix is really to help you to prioritize your actors, your audiences, because oftentimes you can't engage everyone. So you want to be clear on the top 2 or the top 3 actors you really want to engage with your evidence. And so these metrics, when you map your actors on these metrics, it helps you decide that maybe I'm just going to focus my messages on the actors who are in the top left quadrant. And these would be the people who have high power. They're the ones who can give you the change you need, but they have low interest. You know, and so what do you need to do with engaging them to raise the interest so that they can actually address the issue that you are trying to bring about, be they reforms, be they more resources. And so you might want to decide, once you've mapped your actors on the quadrant, to decide that I'll only focus on the actors in the top left quadrant, because there may be the policymakers who can give me the higher budgets I need for this issue, but they have low interest. So what you're doing is really enhancing the interest and trying to get them to address that issue. You might also decide that you want to deal with people in the top right quadrant, and these will be people with high interest, high power. Now, these almost, we look at them like low-hanging fruit, because you're not trying to convince them this issue is important, but also that the people in power, you know, who are able to give you the change you need. And so much of what you're doing, you're probably just providing them with, to ensure they're clear on the solutions you're offering, so that they already have high interest and they can actually go ahead to make the change that you need. And so the actors you put in the top right quadrant, maybe the actors you may decide you want to pay more attention to them, because they're almost like low-hanging fruit that can give you the change that you need almost immediately. Other experts have said that actors who will be in the low power, low interest quadrant are not necessarily your priority actors, because you have to do a lot for you to actually get them to be influential and to bring about the change you need. But others have argued that you could actually have interventions where you move these actors to the upper quadrants, where they can be more influential. Thinking about mapping your audiences, I don't spend a lot of time on this slide, just to note that it's always important as you map your audiences, and especially if your primary audience is a decision maker, to be clear on the levels and the specific people who influence them. So if you're thinking about a decision maker, it might be somebody who's very hard to reach, maybe say the minister, but they have advisors, they have opinion leaders who they listen to, and you might want to map them and maybe even target that group, as opposed to, you know, targeting the decision maker alone, who may be someone who's hard for you to reach. And so thinking about mapping how they are connected to other audiences and other actors is important, because it might give you opportunities of, should I maybe focus more on the advisors and opinion leaders than maybe just trying to chase the minister, who is very hard to reach. So important for you to map as well the links between different types of actors that you're trying to influence. An important point as well is to know your audience, and knowing your audience is really being clear on what they know about your issue. Do they already understand your issue very well? Do they know there are solutions to that issue? Are they even interested in that issue? So being clear on that means that you're also having your messages very strategic in either raising their interest if they're not interested, or if they have low knowledge, you working with them to increase their knowledge on that issue. Whom do they listen to? Very important. You know, sometimes policymakers, particularly politicians, maybe they listen more to the people who vote for them, you know, than to researchers. So you want to decide whether you are going to engage their electorate, or you want to engage them directly. How do they get information? And of course, it also links to where do they get information. You don't want to be putting so much energy in, say, maybe social media and doing a lot of tweeting, and maybe you're trying to reach a policymaker who's not on Twitter. So being very clear on where they get information is important, because it helps you be strategic, you know, in the information that you are, in how you're passing the information to them. What drives or motivates them? You know, this is important, because sometimes you realize that leaders often have a number of things that drive the work that they're doing or the way they lead. So knowing them a bit more means that you can actually either frame your research or your evidence or your engagement with them around the issues that you know motivate them, or the issues they are passionate about, you know, or the issues that really drive them. You also want to understand their constraints, you know, that they may face, because again, working in a political space means that there are many challenges. So you also want to know what is going to stop this leader, you know, from implementing some of the things I'm suggesting they implement. Is it budgets? Is it opposition from, I don't know, religious leaders? Or is it opposition from different advocacy groups? You want to be clear on that so that you know how you either engage those groups or how you frame your messages to be able to counter some of the messages that will stop this primary actor from implementing the change that you want them to implement. And then add their commitments for which these leaders are accountable for. Again, very important, because you can actually, in a strategic way, link your engagement with them to their commitments, you know, so that they can see that you're actually helping them achieve their goals and commitments, as opposed to them doing some extra thing. And so being very clear on what a specific audience you are working with, on their specific commitments and goals, means that you frame your engagement and your messages to those goals. You know, can your messages help them achieve their goals? Can they help them achieve their commitments? You're framing then your messages in a way that they see the value. What is in it for me? And they can see that, in which case they will be more committed. So having, sorry, I've spent a bit of time on the audiences, but it's really important for us to understand our audiences in more depth than just knowing that I'm engaging this group. But this then brings me to the stage, the third stage, which is being clear on your communications objective. So at this point, you have your overarching policy goal. You now know your audiences, you have segmented them, you have analyzed them, you have mapped their power and interest. The next thing now is to define specific communications objective that you would like your efforts to achieve. So think about what you can really achieve via strategic communications that would help you achieve your policy goal. And doing this, we often like to draw on the multiple streams model, which is a model by John Kingdon, an American researcher. But he has try to theorize around how change happens in the political space. And if you look at this diagram here, if you look at the inner three circles in the middle, he theorizes that, sorry, is someone talking? Sorry. He theorizes that problems, and these are development problems, of course, solutions and politics exist in the environment, often parallel. And it's often the case in most cases. We know this is a problem, we know these are the solutions, but change is not happening, you know, because sometimes often there's a lot of politics, a lot of opposition, or just no interest in addressing that issue. And so his argument is that these three things, problem, solutions, and politics, are often flowing parallel to each other within a political space. Now, whenever those three streams merge, then they open a window of opportunity for change. And you find that issues that had been neglected for years rise on the political agenda, and policymakers or development actors then start addressing this issue. So that is his theorizing around how policy change happens or political change happens. Now, communications experts have gone further to say, as opposed to us just sitting here and waiting for those three things to merge, what are the things we can do to bring those three circles together in order to, you know, create an opportunity, a window of opportunity for change. And so we've talked about, experts have come up with three things. One of them is attention focusing. Some of the things you can do to bring these three circles together, these three streams together. And attention focusing is really just ensuring that you're creating a wide range of awareness, you know, and interest in a specific issue that has been neglected over time. And so most of attention focusing efforts will be work with media to ensure the media is talking about this. And so the public becomes more and more aware about this problem, but also about the fact that there are solutions to that problem. In addition to attention focusing, the other thing to do to try and bring these three streams together is policy community strengthening. And policy community strengthening is really about strengthening advocacy, you know, around the issue, so that you're not the only one who is advocating for this, but that you have civil society, you have other groups, you even have political leaders who are advocating for this issue, you know, as one of the ways in which you are expanding the advocacy to bring about change for this specific development problem. And the third thing that experts have talked about is policy learning. And so policy learning has to do with the constantly enhancing policymakers or decision makers' understanding of that issue. But more importantly, often decision makers did not address the issue if we know the problem and solutions, mostly because maybe they don't have enough budgets or the issue is not politically right, you know. And so you are constantly increasing their knowledge about the issue and also trying to make the case of why it's important to address this issue, even for the politics. And so these three things, attention focusing, policy community strengthening, and policy learning, are important dimensions of communications activities that we can do in order to create a window of opportunity for policy change. And so we are bringing this here because we'd like your communications objectives, you know, to speak to some of these issues, especially if you're hoping to have your issue raised on the political agenda and for policymakers to act on it. I'll just give some examples in this last couple of slides before I wrap up and we get into questions and answer. So for instance, if you want to create policy learning, as I said, policy learning is more about enhancing, you know, the knowledge of decision makers about the problem and its implications for development and linking it to other issues as well as the solutions, but also how does that interact with the politics. And so an example of a policy, of a communications objective here, if you're trying to achieve policy learning, is to share evidence with national leaders about why. And this is an example leading to the other example we gave earlier. You'll realize that we're using this example all through the slides. But obviously, I know that your work is very different and you work in very different sectors. And so just bear with me, given that I'm giving examples from a totally different sector. But the example here is to share evidence with national leaders about why adolescent reproductive health is important to help achieve Kenya Vision 2030 development goals, you know. And so here you are constantly sharing new evidence, maybe about implications, new evidence about bigger goals. And so you're ensuring that you are constantly enabling sustained policy learning for that specific issue. Of course, the expected outcome here will be that policymakers have a better understanding of why investments in policies for youth are necessary for them to achieve their bigger strategic goals, which is often something important for top policymakers to achieve. If you're focused on policy community strengthening, as I said, this is expanding the advocacy, you know, around your issue. And so it's really about knowing the advocacy groups working on this issue, but also constantly sharing your evidence with them so that as part of the advocacy efforts, they're actually talking about the evidence and they're talking about your issue. And so they're amplifying your voice in advocacy. An example here is to share findings of adolescent reproductive health policy landscape assessment with a network of NGOs and CSOs working with and for youth in Kenya. Again, just to inform their messages. And the expected outcome here is consensus among stakeholders about the gaps in the current policy, as well as changes needed in a new policy. If you're thinking about focusing your communication efforts on attention focusing, again, as I said, largely here your work will be with the media to create wide-ranging awareness of the issue, its implications, and what needs to be done. And so a possible objective here could be help journalists to understand the barriers that youth face in accessing family planning services through training and study tours. So some of the things you would do with the media and with journalists. And the expected outcome here would be increased quality and quantity of media coverage about your issue. In this case, which is the barriers that youth face in accessing reproductive health services. So these are just really some examples. And I think I need to make the point clear that you may have objectives that touch on each of these three areas, but also you might have objectives that touch on just maybe one or two of them, given what the focus of your issue is, you know. And so it will depend on what your issue is. Advisable to have objectives that touch on all the through, you know, that enable policy learning, policy community strengthening, and attention focusing, or you could still have objectives that touch on just on one of them, depending on what your issue is and where it is within the political space. So that is, I think, the highlights of the slides. And I would like to, of course, we'll be getting into our group work to have some conversations. But before that, of course, we'll have questions and comments and answers before we get into our group work. This slide just has some resources that you could look at later if need be for that. Thank you. Is on the issue of policy goals versus program goals. Is it safe to say that, sorry, I'm just reading it out for everyone before I respond. Is it safe to say that policy goals determine program goals? In the 4 quadrants, okay, so that's a different question, I think. Yes, I think it's safe to say that because policy goals will be at the higher level. And so when you start implementing services or programs, then you're implementing them, or some people are implementing them so that you can achieve a bigger policy goal. So yes, policy goals will shape downstream program goals. I think that the clarification I was making was that we need to, at this point, for this specific training, we are focusing more on changing policies. We are focusing more on bringing about resources for neglected development issues. And so we are thinking more at the higher level as opposed to thinking at the lower service provision level. So that would be my response to that question. And then the second one is in the 4 quadrants of the power metric, the power interest metrics. How do we move audiences from one the other to 3 quadrants? Yeah, and so I didn't spend a lot of time. I mean, that quadrant alone would need maybe 15 minutes to just explain it very well. But yes, you can put in place strategies, influence strategies or engagement strategies that you can try to move audiences from one quadrant to the other. And so thinking of an example where, let's take the example of youth. I think I've been using youth a lot. So let's take the example of youth, for instance. They often will be affected by, say, issues to do with the employment creation or education sector policies. And so in that quadrant, they will be on the right side, the lower quadrant on the right side. They have a lot of interest, but often they'll have very low power, in giving you the change you need as far as job creation or improving education for them is concerned. And so you might want to decide that instead of me advocating myself to the education sector or the people in the job creation sector, for instance, why don't I engage youth? Because there are so many of them right now, they're on the media, on the social media all the time. Why don't I engage them so that I can amplify their voices to advocate for these issues themselves? In that case, you're actually trying to move youth from the area of high interest, low power. So they will be in the lower quadrant on the right, and you're trying to move them maybe to the top quadrant where they would have, you're increasing their influence, and so you're rising them to the top right quadrant where you're increasing their influence so that they can have a bigger voice in engaging policymakers through their advocacy, through different media. And so, yes, you can come up with communications, engagement strategies that try to move one audience to the next group. Obviously, there are always tough questions there because people can't immediately become policymakers. You can't move me from being a researcher to a policymaker, but you can increase my influence. You can increase my power in influencing the policymakers who are the ones who will likely act on your issue or give you the budget line you need or the increased budgets that you need. So hopefully that suffices. The next question is about terminology-wise. Can stakeholders be used interchangeably with audiences? Yes, absolutely. When I talk about audience, I'm talking about stakeholders. Some people will call them actors, but they're basically stakeholders, so no problem with that at all. Is there any technical difference between the two in strategic communications? There isn't technical difference between the two. I think communication professionals, we like to call them audiences, but when it comes to policy and political engagement, I actually prefer to call them stakeholders or actors, as opposed to, I find audiences to be a bit passive, whereas actors and stakeholders, I find it to be more active. They have agency, they have power to influence, so they can be used interchangeably. The next question is, I don't know if I'm tracking this very well. Okay, so the next question is it possible for high interest persons in corporate bodies to attain high. I think I've responded to that. They can't become policymakers unless if they change jobs, but you can increase their influence level, you know. So by strengthening the advocacy efforts, you know, by challenging them to link directly with some of the political actors who make big decisions. Sometimes I challenge researchers to engage directly with parliamentary committees on budgets, on health, you know, because those committees discuss budgets, they discuss resources. And so engaging with them directly means that you're increasing your influence power on them, on the kinds of decisions that they make. And so yes, you can increase the influence of power of different actors, depending on your engagement strategies that you're implementing. The next question is it possible that there is a relationship between policy goal and program goal? I.e., can policy goal influence program goal? Yeah, I think I've responded to that. Policy goals will largely influence program goals. And also depending on how programs are being implemented. So I completely agree, and I really like that example. I think it makes something clear. Mrs. Emamoke, thank you very much for bringing that up. So the way programs are implemented, the lessons coming out of that, they can actually come back to influence a policy goal, you know. So it's not just policy influencing programs, but also programs and the outcomes of that often come up to help us decide whether do we need more funds, do we need a new policy, do we need to update a policy. And so yes, it's a unidirectional, you know, relationship as opposed to, it's bidirectional, it's bidirectional and not unidirectional relationship there. The other question, I think the final question from the private slides is, in the power interest matrix, how can you influence decisions, policymakers with low interest? Oh, sorry, I'm not clear on that. How can you influence decisions with policymakers with low interest and low power? Okay, maybe I'm not very clear on that question, but I think to respond, so some of the things we are going to be talking about, the communications, particularly this strategic communications component, the idea is for you to implement a communication and engagement effort that brings about change. And part of bringing about change is really moving some of these actors, either increasing their interest in the issue, making it clear for them on why they need to pay attention to a neglected issue, in which case you are increasing their interest. And so the idea of our communication session and some of the activities you're going to do is to really be moving actors, either you're increasing their influence or you're increasing their interest. And so the mapping was useful because it helps you know where people are. And so you're coming up with activities and interventions that are either increasing their interest in the issue or increasing their power. That was the value of mapping your actors on the power matrix interest, so that you know you are more strategic, you know, in the way you are engaging them, and you are clear whether you are increasing their interest if their interest was low. And in many cases for policymakers, their interest will be low on some of these development issues, you know. So they may have all the power, they can give you the budgets, but often their interest on that issue is low because sometimes people say this issue is not killing anyone. Or sometimes they don't even know that it's killing people, and so they don't see it as a priority. And so a lot of the work you'll be doing in engaging them is increasing their interest so that they can act on that issue. There is a question here. Sorry, I'm just trying to run through in a more systematic way. How can we effectively engage lawmakers for their buy-in into policy goal, especially when they are indifferent to such a policy issue? So we are going to be talking about some tips in the session we have today in doing some of the things here, like increasing policymakers' interest in an issue that they're indifferent to. It would be good to give a specific example, maybe in this particular case. I'm thinking of an issue like, and sorry, I'll be giving examples touching on health and population because I've been involved in a lot of work in that area. So you look at policymakers, a lot of African presidents have been opposed to the discourses around family planning because they look at that as controlling population growth, you know, and a lot of them argue that Africa is a large continent, you know, where we have a lot of resources. And so, we have a big land, we have lakes and all that. And so we don't need to be reducing our population. Now, some of the things that actors in this area have done is to make the link between rapid population growth and development, because these same presidents want their governments to be growing, and so framing that evidence so that it's not really about controlling population growth, but it's enabling the populations you have to be productive and to help you achieve your development goals for your country. This kind of framing and engagement has actually brought about a turnaround in some African countries, not all of them, but we've seen a turnaround in a country like Uganda. President Museveni was a big opponent of anything that talks about family planning. He was completely opposed to it, but the framing and just making it clear that investing in enabling families to have the numbers of children they can actually take care of is good for you as a president. It helps in your strategic goals. And so in 2014, 2015, he actually had a turnaround and he said, I'm really going to prioritize some of these population planning policies, which I haven't prioritized because I never thought it was useful. For me, I wanted Uganda to be as big as possible, but he's had a turnaround over the years to see the value of him enabling his people to have the number of children they can actually take care of over time. And so some of this can be ideological though, which when it comes to ideology, often there isn't much you can change, but sometimes it has to do with how do you frame your evidence. How are you, even what evidence are you presenting and how are you presenting that evidence? And it's part of the things we are going to be talking about later today, and especially when you get to the messaging session in the afternoon. That we get, because people are going to get opportunity to speak in the groups. So I would suggest we right away get into the 3 groups and use the template 1. So template 1 requires people to identify a problem in their technical working groups and then go ahead to define a policy goal, discuss some of the primary audiences and their interests, and then also get to defining at least one clear communications goal, objective. And so I think they will be able to talk within the groups. And so maybe we don't get to talking around, we just get right into our groups for exercise 1, which is using template 1, which I hope everyone
how many
has.
minutes?
Yeah, the time was limited, and I think I had an opportunity to listen in different groups, and I think a lot of them were still agreeing on the major policy issue that they need to focus on. And that's important, because then that is the issue that these exercises are built around. The idea of these exercises was also that the conversations can continue outside of this training, because the working groups have been set around researchers and policymakers working on a specific area. And so some of the conversations that start here could continue beyond, this 20 minutes or 15 minutes here and there. So in terms of how we move forward, the second exercise was to build on the first exercise. Template 2 was mainly getting you to think more now about the partnerships and networks you need to create around the policy issue that you have identified. I know that the first template already has a space where you break down your audience and think a bit more what they know and what they don't know, and also think about a communications goal, which I know that many of you have not moved from the first, the first area. So I would suggest that in the interest of time, if we can shortly get back into groups, but focus on, for the first template, focus on defining your policy issue. So once the group agrees on the policy issue, please outline it in the template and then agree on the policy goal. What change do you want to bring about at the policy level on that issue? And then don't do the other 2 sections. The other sections, the one on audiences and objectives, I don't think we have time for that. So once you're clear on your policy problem, your policy issue and the policy goal, then you can use template 2 to think a bit more about the specific partnerships and networking you need to do around that issue in more practical terms. So thinking about which policymakers are working on this issue, which ones do we need to engage to tackle this issue, what about the media? What about civil society? I think that gets us more into more practical thinking about the different actors we need to bring on board as we work on tackling this issue. And so for template 1, we do the first number 1 and number 2, and then we go to template 2 where we break down or identify the audiences, the actors in a bit more detail. I don't know if that's a Thank you very much. I think I've really learned a lot joining the different groups and the discussions, very interesting discussions, lots of progress. So these exercises, as I said earlier, I didn't think that we were going to complete them, but it was a good place to start, you know. And as Dr. Shogbamu says, it should be okay for the groups to work even outside of today if you want to continue, because some of these are practical things. The things that you are tackling within the different technical working groups. And so while this group work was really meant for us to get our hands dirty and discuss, there should be things that we can continue, you know, well beyond today. I have learned, I think, one thing. I like the breakout groups, because if this meeting was face-to-face, I don't think Dr. Shogbam would be able to bring us back. Here, like he's doing, he just clicks a button and we are all back, you know. I think in face-to-face meetings, we would have to go to different breakout rooms and get people, and they would say, give us 5 more minutes. So I think the technology works quite okay. I know it stops people mid-sentence. I was in a nice group that was mid-sentence and we were all moved back. But as we've said, I think let's feel free to continue engaging. And if you open up the rooms, maybe the groups could feel free to continue having conversations around these activities. Well, as an important thing, I think, which is very important, I like that the group spend a lot of time defining the policy problem. That is really an important issue that you need to be clear on what the policy problem is. And so the group should not feel bad that they didn't get to complete that. You shouldn't feel bad that you spent maybe the past 2 minutes just defining what the policy problem is, because sometimes, I mean, people say a lot of policy problems are wicked problems. They have a lot of dimensions around them. And so you spending some time defining those is important. And sometimes you want to come back to looking at the policy that is in place. What are the gaps in that policy? You know, and some of those discussions were actually being had in the different groups. So we have a policy, say, on waste management, for instance, if I may use a relevant example. If we have a policy on waste management, why is it not being implemented? You know, what is the challenge? Is it because there are no budgets? Is it because there is no clear government agency that should be steering the implementation of this policy? You know, or is it because there are no, there's no implementation plan? So often a lot of governments will have a policy lying somewhere in on a shelf, but there's no implementation plan. That policy does not get translated into annual work plans, where some of the broader policy goals actually get broken down into activities in annual work plans. And then besides annual work plans, you actually have monitoring and evaluation, where every year these work plans are being looked at and you see how you're making progress towards achieving the commitments made in a specific policy. So I think it was okay that we spend a lot of time, the different groups spend a lot of time analyzing their problem, like what is the problem as far as this issue is concerned. That's very important. I would have loved to get to see at least the policy goals of each of the 3 groups. I did see in one of the groups I was in, but of course I was spending a few minutes in different groups. And so for I think 2 of the groups, I didn't see the policy goals. And so I would suggest if you can share with Dr. Shukbamu, then I'll obviously be able to have them. But your policy goal then is focusing on the change you want, given the policy issue or policy problem that you have defined very well. And that's what we were doing in the first step of this exercise. And so it would be good to get the specific policy goals that we have outlined for ourselves. I know groups, there was a bit of, I think, discussion around having broader statements, but also very important for us to have a specific, you know, policy action that you want. Are you looking to bring about a new policy? If it's a neglected issue and it has no policy, or in the groups that I was in, there was actually policies in place. So are we looking to stimulate implementation of those policies, you know? And to stimulate implementation, what do we need? Do we need to focus on having the government introduce a budget line for that issue? Often some of these development issues that get neglected, often you find that they don't even have a budget line. So they don't have a budget vote. So nobody's putting in money as even though there is a policy in place. And so do we need to work around creating a budget line? So engaging the relevant agencies within the ministries and treasury to create a budget line for that policy issue. That could be a good policy goal, you know. Do we need to support the development of an implementation plan, you know? Do we need to engage government in ensuring that they have a clear agency or department that is steering the implementation of the policy? So very, very important, because the evidence or research that you have will be speaking to the specific policy action you are hoping to bring about with your engagement. The exercise on partnerships and networking, the idea was to really to get the groups think beyond, to think in more specific terms, you know, about the different government agencies you need to engage as far as your policy issue and goal is concerned. And so being more practical in terms of in Parliament, you know, which parliamentary committees do we need to be engaged? These would be the ones that actually discuss our budgets for that specific issue. And so analyzing that is so important, because it means you're not just communicating, you know, but you are targeting very specific actors within government agencies, within Parliament, within the media that you are targeting. And that's an important of being strategic in your communications. I find that I've worked a lot with researchers, and I find that often they will be passing just messages out, you know, sending out messages without being specific on who am I trying to influence, without even building relationships. And that is what is important when you are able to clearly define the specific actors you want to target. Then you build relationships with them. You ensure you're on the table when they're discussing important things. And so you are getting to influence those important things. What is really rich in this group is that we have policymakers and researchers together, and that really enriched the conversations. I really think it's a good way of doing this, Dr. Shogbamu, in terms of having policymakers together with the researchers to discuss. So I think the policymakers were clearly helping us understand what is the policy gap, you know, and so we have a policy. Why is it not being implemented? They can give those explanations. So I think it works very, very